Shabbat Shalom to everyone. Someone in the hallway suggested that this was like a bar mitzvah. Perhaps in some ways it is. But before we commence our service, I just want to make just very brief introductory remarks and to thank all of you for the great honor and privilege to begin. Oh, thank you. Can you all hear me back there? You can't hear me? Get a little closer. How's that? Better. Okay, good. Thank you. I have a little bit of a soft voice, so we'll work on that as we go through the service. I want to thank everyone who is here as a congregation for the privilege and the opportunity to serve as your next rabbi. Especially, I want to give a special thanks to members of the search committee that was chaired by Dana and Gil, our president. I've told both of them, and I hope that they've communicated it to the search committee, that I would not have come had it not been for the thoughtful and considerate ways in which we communicated. And then, of course, my one-day virtual visit here, in which I was so impressed with all that you have accomplished in the past and in the present, and what you have worked through, especially this past year with the challenges of the pandemic. So I want to thank all of you, really from the bottom of my heart, as we commence our service. And I would like to invite Maggie, our Rebbitzin, and a friend of ours who has just relocated to Mobile, in part because of our raving about the community. Her name is Heidi Slowinski, and we invite them now to light the Shabbat candles as we begin our service on page 1. Amen. And we continue now with the prayer of gratitude on page 5. Please join with me. Page 5. Together, I begin with a prayer of gratitude for all that is holy in my life. God needs no words, no English or Hebrew, no semantics and no services. But I need them. Through prayer, I can sense my inner strength, my inner purpose, my inner joy, my capacity to love. As I reach upward in prayer, I sense these qualities in my Creator. To love God, to love each other, no work to make our lives better. To love God is to love the world God created, and to work to perfect it. To love God is to love dreams of peace and joy that illumine all of us. and to bring that vision to life. Our service continues now with join in the singing of the Hine Matov, followed by Yedid Nefesh on page 7. And we continue now with the Lecha Dodi on page 8. And now that we have joined in fellowship together with the Hine Matov, and our hearts join in service to God, Lecha Dodi welcomes the Shabbat, welcomes the Shabbat bride, is the allusion of this beautiful 17th century poem that fills us with the spirit of Shabbat as we continue our service now on page 8 and page 9. We will chant the first two verses, verses 1 and 2, and then on verse 9 we will rise and face the door as if the Shabbat spirit fills this sanctuary.
Lecha לשם ותפארת ולתהילה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לקראת שבת לכו ונלכה, כי היא מקור הברכה, מראש מקדם ניסוחה, סוף מעשה במחשבה תקלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה.
Please rise.
בואי ושלום עטרת בעלה, גם בשמחה ובצולה, תוך אמוני ים סגולה. בואי חלה, בואי חלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה.
You may be seated. The words Shabbat Shalom are really formed by the beautiful Lachadudi that we all joined in prayer, and the Shalom Aleichem, which we recite when we greet somebody. A traditional Jew will say to someone, Shalom Aleichem, and someone will respond, Aleichem Shalom. So if we put the two together, from Lachadudi, which emphasizes the Shabbat, and the Shalom Aleichem, which we're about to chant, we put those together, that forms the sort of the basis of Shabbat Shalom. We continue now with Shalom Aleichem on page 10.
Shalom Aleichem, Malachi Hasharet, Malachi Elyon, Mi Melech Malchi Hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Bachem LaShalom, Malachi HaShalom, Malachi Elyon. Mi Melech Malchi Hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Barakuni LaShalom, Malachi HaShalom, Malachi Elyon. Mi Melech Malchi Hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Zitchem LaShalom, Malachi HaShalom, Malachi Elyon. Mi Melech Malchi Hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu.
So much of our nusach, our melodies, are taken from the regions in which the melodies were composed. So, for example, much of our Friday night prayers, the melodies, some of them are taken from the URJ camp experience. Debbie Friedman, that's where she really got most of her inspiration, and many of her melodies are what we sing. Some of the older melodies, like what we just sang, Shalom Aleichem, probably came from Eastern Europe. You can hear the minor and the beautiful sensitivity that they had as they welcomed the Shabbat. Debbie Friedman composed this Yit Gadal, and I have a feeling that she had this region in mind. We continue now on page 11, followed immediately by the Baruch Hu. When the Chatzi Kaddish, the prayer on page 11, is complete, please rise for the Baruch Hu. Please rise. Oh, you already sang it. You may be seated. Our service continues now on page 13 in the middle of the page. This is an hour of change. Let us join together. This is an hour of change. Within it we stand uncertain on the border of light. Shall we draw back or cross over? Where shall our hearts turn? Shall we draw back, my brother, my sister, or cross over? This is the hour of change, and within it we stand quietly on the border of light. What lies before us? Shall we draw back, my brother, my sister, or cross over? Baruch atah Adonai hama'ariv aravim. And let us join in prayer on the top of page 14, As You Taught Torah. As you taught Torah to those whose names I bear, teach me Torah too. Its mystery beckons, yet I struggle with its truth. You mean the truth for me. Did you mean the struggle for me too? Don't let me struggle alone. Help me to understand, to be wise, to listen, to know. Lead me into the mystery. Baruch atah Adonai, Ohev Amo Yisrael. Before we chant the Shema, we're going to introduce a nusach or a melody. Some of you may be familiar with it. We'll start with La La La. We'll do the Shema twice, and we'll do the Baruch Shem Kavod. And I think by the time we get to the Shema, you'll be familiar with it. The Shema is really a meditation on the oneness and uniqueness of God. Sometimes we think of the word echad in the Shema Yisrael as being one, that there is no other God. But it also is one in the sense of unique. In the sense, and if we think about it deeply, we realize just how difficult it is to even begin to conceptualize God, who is beyond form, beyond the physical, and is true spirit. God is beyond time and God is beyond space, and yet in some way God is also within that time. And so the Echad that we chant in the final word of the Shema emphasizes this unique characteristic of how we think about, and our minds are limited as we conceptualize God, as we reflect on the true essence of God. We're going to continue now with the Shema. We'll begin with the Nigun, page 15 and 16, and of course that will be followed by the V'ahavta. You may rise.
La 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 la. לבקר וכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך, והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלתך בדרך ובשובך ובקומך, וקשקתם להיות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בעיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתיכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם.
Let us join in prayer on top of page 18. Standing on the parted shores of history, we still believe what we were taught before ever we stood at Sinai's foot, that wherever we go, it is eternally Egypt, that there is a better place, a promised land, that the winding way to that promise passes through the wilderness, that there is no way to get from here to there except by joining hands and marching together. We continue with the Micha Mocha, page 19.
We'll start with a nigun on this one, just for those who may not be familiar with it, and then it's pretty catchy, so I think you can catch on after that. So, Micha Mocha.
Ya ba ba bim dim bam, ya ba ba bim bam, ya ba ba bim bim bam, ya ba ba bim bam, ay 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 ay, ya ba ba bim bam, ay 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 ay, ya ba ba bim bam, mi hamocha ne'ilim Adonai, mi hamocha nehedar b'kodesh, norah tehilot osefele, norah tehilot osefele, ma'alechutecha ranu vanecha, bokei ayam livnei Moshe Miriam, Zeheli, Zeheli, Anu ve'amru, Adonai imlok leolam va'ed. One more time with the nigun. Ya ba ba bim bim bam, ya ba ba bim bam, ya ba ba bim bim bam, ya ba ba bim bam, ay 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 ay, ya ba ba bim bam, ay 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 ay, ya ba ba bim bam.
ונאמר כי פדה אדוני את יעקב, וגיאלו מיד חזק ממנו, ברוך אתה אדוני גאל Yisrael. Blessed are you, God, who redeems Israel. Let us join in prayer on page 21, the middle of the page. Give us a place to rest, Adonai, our God. Together, give us a place to rest, Adonai, our God. Bring us into shelter in the soft, long evening shadows of your truth. For with you are true protection and safety, and in your presence are acceptance and gentle love. Watch over us as we go forth. Prepare for us as we return. Spread over us your shelter of peace over all Jerusalem and yours. Baruch atah Adonai Hapores Sukat Shalom Olenu, V'al Kol Amo Yisrael, V'al Yerushalayim. We're going to join now in the singing of the Vishamru on page 22. Vishamru v'nei Yisrael et HaShabbat la'asot et HaShabbat l'dorotam berit olam. Join with me if you can.
Vishamru v'nei Yisrael et HaShabbat la'asot et HaShabbat l'dorotam berit olam. Beini uvein bnei Israel ut hi leolam. Beini uvein bnei Israel ut hi leolam.
Ki sheishet yamim asa Adonai et hashamayim v'et haaretz uvayom hashvi'i Shabbat vayinavash.
Beini uvein bnei Israel ut hi leolam. Beini uvein bnei Israel ut hi leolam. Vishamru bnei Israel et HaShabbat la'asot et HaShabbat l'dorotam berit olam.
We will now rise as we join in the tefillah, beginning on page 23, and we will chant all the way through to page 25, and then the Atah Kodosh on page 27. At the conclusion of that section, you're invited to engage in silent meditation, either through the reading of the prayers that are listed here to page 33, or in your own silent devotions to God and to your own reflections. When we complete the Ha'el HaKadosh, that section where we finish joining together, you may either remain standing, as is your tradition, or of course you may be seated. Eloheinu, And you continue silently, either with your own meditations or in the prayer book to page 33. You may either do that standing or sitting, as is your preference.
Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael.
Just a quick observation. It is wonderful to hear so many voices. I know that it was mentioned to me, I won't say by who, that, well, the congregation doesn't really sing. They sing, but it's kind of quiet and they're kind of shy, but you all sound beautiful this evening. It really adds to the richness of our service to hear collectively you all joining in prayer and singing as you as you are doing so this evening, and I expect you all to come back next week. You think I'm kidding? I already sound like your rabbi, right? On this July 4th weekend, a devout Torah, a sermon on freedom from a Jewish perspective seems appropriate. So I'll begin by quoting Robert Frost, the great American poet, who delivered a lecture on that very subject. He mused on two propositions, one traditionally associated with liberty, and the other quite serious. One is freedom from. For example, there is freedom from slavery that our ancestors experienced in Egypt, or in more modern times, freedom from parental supervision, such as when we get our first driver's license or when we go off to college. But the other is freedom of, the freedom of something. And that is the focus of Robert Frost's lecture, and that is the focus of my sermon. This different kind of freedom, the freedom of, is made me think of this week's Torah portion, Pinchas. Pinchas was the grandson of Aaron, and the portion begins as an aftermath to the conclusion of the previous Parsha, Balak. Some may recall the beautiful Devar Torah of Rabbi Treif. His focus was on the famous phrase that's found in our liturgy, where Bilam, the prophet for hire by Balak, is to curse Israel. However, because he is a prophet, he can only recite the words that God puts in his mouth. So therefore, Balak says, when he sees the children of Israel, this famous phrase, Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov mishkanotacha Yisrael, how goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your tabernacle, O Israel. Not much of a curse, but rather a blessing. So after this failed attempt, what is often overlooked and kind of ignored, and for good reason, but one that I found interesting, Bilam counsels Balak. And he says to him, if you want the Israelites destroyed, turn their God against them by seducing them into idol worship. Balak does succeed. The Israelites, our ancestors, have once again turned to idolatry. Moses and the elders of Israel sit in anguish as they watch an Israelite enter the tent of meeting, the sacred space where in the Kavod Adonai, the honor of God is dwelling. And once inside, they engage in idolatry, thus violating the basic principle of our faith. God's wrath is once again rekindled, and according to the narrative, God sends a plague to spread throughout the people. With a spear in hand, Pinchas enters the tent of meeting, where he impales both of them. The epidemic now ends, but not before 14,000 people have perished. It is in this aftermath where our Parsha begins with God stating, Hineni, I am here among you, no, I have not left you. And I am giving to Pinchas the Brit Shalom, a covenant of peace. And this Brit Shalom will be eternal for him and for his descendants. They will forever be the Kohanim, offering prayers and making atonement for Israel in the generations to follow. They will be the ones to enter the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. They will be the ones to recite the Yivarechecha, may God bless you and may God keep you. May God shine God's countenance among you and bestow grace upon you. May God lift up God's presence unto you and give you peace. Now, before we dismiss Pinchas's act as too brutal in terms of modern sensibility, let us return to Robert Frost's idea of freedom of. He provides a relatively simple description, yet I think a profound insight into the true nature of freedom. Referring to this freedom of, he explores its significance by referencing, of all things, the game of tennis as an illustration, but golf also applies. He writes, "You don't want a freedom from the tennis court. You want the freedom of the tennis court, with the net just so high and the court just so large. And you don't want to go to conventions for changing the tennis court like reformers. You're no reformer. You just want to see what good you are on the tennis court as it is." Taking Frost's lecture or description of freedom of, let us now apply it to our faith and heritage, that is, the freedom of Judaism, in which we commit ourselves to an ethical code rooted in a godlike transcendence that includes the struggle for justice, for righteousness, and for a better world. It is the freedom of Judaism that compels us to v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, to love our neighbor as ourselves. The freedom of being in the court of Judaism and seeing just how good we can be through Torah, through avodah, and gemilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness, the three pillars, really, of Sha'arei Shamayim. We commit to the freedom of Judaism because it has the stuff that makes life meaningful. Pinchas's act of killing those who defiled the sacred tent of meeting in light of modernity seems brutal, doesn't it? Seems brutal. Hard to think of walking into a tent and impaling two people with a spear. Yet I found myself thinking, how many have killed and been killed for the sake of our country's most cherished ideals? On this July 4th weekend, we recall that famous phrase from the Declaration of Independence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, that is, all human beings, are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Many have died so that we could exercise our freedom from and our freedom of us here this evening." Now, President Emeritus of Dartmouth College, historian James Wright, wrote a seminal work that was titled "Those Who Have Borne the Battle, A History of America's Wars and Those Who Fought Them." In one section, he begins by reciting the Gettysburg Address. Quote, "The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of their devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain." Wright then comments, "Lincoln fully embraced and indeed glorified the broader cause that necessitated the Civil War in his remarks. But in less deft hands, the argument would shift. If one dies in a legal war on behalf of the nation, those who survive are obliged to indeed pick up the spear and the flag and continue the battle." I submit to you this evening that Temple Sha'arei Shamayim has lifted the spear of this freedom of Judaism by carrying on the work of our temple ancestors. These temple ancestors dedicated so much of their lives for close to 2 centuries to maintain a vibrant Jewish spiritual presence here in Mobile Think about this. Through a civil war, through 2 world wars, severe economic depression, the civil rights movement, and most recently, and history will also record, what we did here during this pandemic. Indeed, you and they have lived the freedom of Judaism. We have gone through traumatic periods where lesser congregations have closed their doors. We hallow those who are buried in our cemetery. In doing so, we shall never forget our loved ones who lived and exercised the freedom of their Judaism. And for me, there is no better proof than all of you who are gathered here this evening that that is a commitment to all that Sha'arei Shamayim represents. Your belief, your faith in Torah, in Jewish peoplehood, and the importance of our community is the chomer, the building blocks of a bright and promising future. I am more honored than you could possibly imagine to serve as your rabbi as we go forward together in the exercise of our freedom of Judaism in building a vibrant Jewish world for ourselves, for our children, and for generations to follow. Amen.
Keep asking.
We're going to continue now with Shalom Rav.
31.
Page 31. Please join us.
Shalom Rav Yisrael Amcha Tasim Le'olam. Shalom Rav Yisrael Amcha Tasim Le'olam. Ki Ata Melech Adon Lechol HaShalom. Ki Ata Melech Adon Lechol HaShalom. Shalom Rav Yisrael Amcha Tasim Le'olam. Shalom Rav Yisrael Amcha Tasim Le'olam. V'tov beinecha levarech et Amcha Yisrael b'chol et u'v'kosha b'shlomecha. Shalom Rav Yisrael Amcha Tasim Le'olam. Shalom Rav Yisrael Amcha Tasim Le'olam. Tasim Le'olam. Tasim Le'olam.
Our service continues now with the prayer Misha Berach, a prayer for those in need of physical, spiritual, or emotional healing. That may be found on page 34. We will chant the first verse. We'll pause. and then we'll recite the names that were given to us regarding those in need of such spiritual healing or physical healing. And then we'll turn first to the people who are joining us on Zoom, and then to all of you to add names of those who are in such need. So we begin in the middle of page 34 with the Mishaberach. Our prayer for healing this month includes Molly Adams, Paul Bradley, Alan Hall, Nora Eloise Palaleo, Harold Fink, Robin Mayer, Murray Muchnick, Mark Siegel, Rabbi Noginsky, and those families and relatives and friends who are grieving for lost loved ones because of the collapse of the Surfside condominiums in Florida. Now I'll turn to the people in Zoom for them to unmute and to add those in our thoughts and prayers at this time.
Jennifer Sundberg.
Now turn to members of the congregation.
Rachel.
Alex Glass.
Marty Carson. Dr. John Johnson.
Please rise for the Olenu on page 35.
Shalom.
You may be seated. This week, we observed the yahrzeit of Leon Stern. Observing this yahrzeit is Cole and Ellie Appleman. Herbert P. Petty-Feibelman III. Observing this yahrzeit is Mrs. Phyllis Feibelman. Herbert Feibelman Jr. Observing this yahrzeit is Mrs. Phyllis Feibelman. Harold Renard. Observing this yahrzeit is Mr. and Mrs. Harvey Gandler. Raymond Hirsch. Observing this yahrzeit is Mr. Alan Hirsch. Cassius Fishbein. Observing this yahrzeit is Mrs. Cassie Fishbein and Dr. and Mrs. Gary Fishbein. Max Keller. Observing this yahrzeit is Mrs. Perry Lewis. Albert Klein. Observing this yahrzeit is Iris Klein. Is there anyone observing a yahrzeit or saying Kaddish for someone who they wish to remember at this time? I will first have the people in Zoom, and then we'll turn to the congregation. Okay. Congregation.
Thomas Mogensen.
Thank you.
My mother, Susan Foster.
In solemn testimony to that unbroken faith which links generations one to another, that those who mourn and those whose tradition it is to stand and to recite the words of the Kaddish on page 43. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shmei Rabbah Bi'alma divrach chilutei v'yamnich malchutei v'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael ba'agala u'vizman kariv imru Amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevorach leolam u'lalmei almaya Yitborach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh V'yithadar, v'yitdaleh, v'yitdalal, shemei dekudsha perichu, le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbachata v'nechemata, ta'amiran bi'alma v'imru Amen. Yehei shlomo rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru Amen. Oseh shalom bimromav, Hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'imru Amen. May God, who establisheth peace unto the heavens, grant peace and comfort in the hearts of all who mourn, and let us say, Amen. You may be seated. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our president, Gil Layden, who will extend greetings and announcements.
Shabbat Shalom. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure to be standing up here, I should say, tonight with Rabbi Boraz. It's been a long road, but it was well worth it. I think we will all agree. So thank you, Rabbi. In the announcements, I noted that where I'm reading for the services, every one of them says, with Rabbi Edward Boraz from our sanctuary. So that's a nice thing to be able to see. As you may know, Rabbi Boraz wants to meet with as many congregants as possible as he begins his tenure, which actually started yesterday. So if you haven't met with the rabbi, would like to, please let him know, and he will be glad to arrange for that. He's been doing that since he came here some 6 weeks ago. Beginning July 10th, we will be holding monthly Shabbat morning services followed by a Torah study. Excuse me. Services will begin at 10 a.m. with a Kiddush, followed by a Torah study at 11 and concluding no later than 11:45. There's more information about all this in the kind notes that came out yesterday. And as you may know, Tisha B'Av is Hebrew for the 9th of the Jewish month of Av, and there will be a special service to be held on Saturday, June the 17th at 7 p.m. And it'll be a 1-hour memorial candle lighting service, which will include several selections. So please come to that service. And we are also updating our membership info. I see that we have some of the people that are leading that, Miriam Fry, and Priscilla Go-Darby, and Carol Ebeline. We want to be able to get a good, accurate information on our membership. If you were not able to attend the annual meeting or didn't attend via Zoom, a form will have been mailed with your dues statement, and if you return that information by July the 15th, your name will be automatically entered into a drawing for a bottle of wine. So that should be incentive to you. Torah study will continue on Wednesday with Rabbi Borath. The next one is scheduled for this coming Wednesday on July the 7th at 5:30 in the Temple Library, both in person and via Zoom. And when services conclude, as you know, we have an ONEG set up in the social halls, and we want to thank Amy Freelander, Carol Ebeline, and Diane Frank for that, along with Sandy Hallberg for providing the flowers. But please allow the rabbi to descend from the pulpit and let him go into the social hall, and you will have an opportunity to greet him. So Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Before we conclude our service, just as we remember those whom we love, whether in those who have passed on, and also those who are needing spiritual and physical healing, we have also Simcha to celebrate. And so I want to announce the July anniversaries and the July birthdays. And we want to extend a Mazal Tov to those. Celebrating an anniversary in July is Margaret and Milton Brown, Maury and Michael Sternberg, Diane and Richard Frank, Patty and Gary Fishbein, and Sarisa and Paul Frankel. So Mazal Tov to all of you. And we want to extend happy birthday greetings to Peter Sussman, Charlie Brown, Lynn Rader, Dana Furman, Erwin Misrock, Linda Blassingame, David Zimmerman, Ellen Layden Zivitz, Katie Webster, Glenn Muchnick, Rachel Borak, Jay Ross, Steve Weinstein, James Perry, David Zimmerman, Maud Patterson, Ed Blassingame, Leslie Miller, and Ada Small. Why don't we join in a happy birthday because some of them are actually here this evening. So let's join in a happy birthday. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear everyone in July who's celebrating a birthday. Happy birthday to you. A nice rendition of Happy Birthday. We're going to do something a little special, but I understand you may have done this last year or in years past. We're going to conclude our service first with the singing of America the Beautiful, and then we'll go to Kiddush and Motzi, and following the Kiddush and Motzi, there will be a benediction. Okay, so we'll remain standing for that. But first America the Beautiful.
Feel free to join in. Please don't let me sing by myself. I've done too much of that tonight. So.
I think they're going to let you.
Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountains' majesties, above the fruited plain. We'll take it down an octave. America, America, God shed his grace on thee, and crown thy good with brotherhood, from sea to shining sea. It's hard to choose a note on your own.
Please rise for the Kiddush. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, borei brit hayamim. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, Asher yishon b'mitzvotav v'atzavanu. Shabbat shalom v'aharon v'atzon yichanu. Zikaron v'maaseh v'reishis. Kiburion v'tefillah v'mikrot v'kodesh. Zecher l'tziyah b'Mitzrayim. Kivanu l'charta v'yotanu kiyashta v'kol ha'amim v'shabbat kodshecha v'yavaru v'ratzon v'natanu baruch atah Adonai v'kadesh Hashabbat. Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hamotzii lechem מן הארץ. Amen. Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. May God bless you and may God guard you. Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'chuneka. May God lift up God's presence unto you and be gracious unto you. Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. May God lift up God's presence unto you and give you peace and wholeness of life. And let us say, Amen. Shabbat shalom.